So in this chapter, chapter 5, what we're kind of building on now is this idea that in the first chapter, again, we just talked about how economists think of the world, and that individuals and firms make optimal decisions on the margin, meaning that they compare marginal benefits to marginal costs. And then in the previous chapter on demand and supply, what we did is we talked about how that decision looks like if we start to construct a market where demand and supply conditions exist, and that the result is that there's an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity, and that the interaction of that demand and supply gives us the price that we have. And we ended that chapter with kind of a little bit of a extended discussion of why it was better to have the market determine the price rather than, let's say, something like the government with a price floor and a price ceiling, because the problem was that the market then had a perpetual shortage and surplus. What this chapter does is it builds from that to some extent, and it talks about cases where the market does not operate properly. By market, we mean what would be a situation where demand and supply doesn't create the result that you want. And this happens in two cases. One, in an area known as the public good, and the second, in an area where there's an externality. We're going to obviously talk about both of these, but just to give you an idea, a public good would be something like the military, or the fire department, or the police department, or 911. These are all things that generate the public as a whole. Now, should the market determine those things or provide those things? Not necessarily. And then we're going to deal with a set of goods that generate externalities. Externalities means that the activity either generates a benefit for others, like let's say like an art museum, right, where people then get to appreciate culture and whatnot, or it imposes a cost on everyone else. Like, for instance, when I drive my car and it makes pollution. So how does a market deal with things where there's external benefits and external costs imposed to others by the fact that I'm doing something? Both of those situations, the public good and the externalities, are situations where there's a market failure. And by market failure, what we mean is that the market is not producing the right amount of the product. By the right amount, we basically are saying that there's a little bit of a in some sense, a little bit of a social understanding of what the right amount is. Right? It's the society that gets to determine whether something is right or not. Right? Some could say that healthcare is a public good, that everyone should have access to healthcare. Others may say that that's not the case. Only those who can afford it are the ones who should get it. Well, where we as a society come out on that reflects in some sense what our societal goals are. Or let's take something probably more applicable to Hawaii, preschool. Right? Preschool is not a right for individuals. Those who get access to it are those who can afford it. So, right, in other states and other cities, everyone has an access to 3-year-old preschool and 4-year-old preschool. Right? That's different then, right, in terms of whether we rely on the market or not. Because you're not getting the right amount then what you're saying is that then you're either getting too much of something or too little of something. So what would be the two ways that we could look at this happening? The one way that we could look at this happening would be a situation where, let's see, I've learned now what is causing this problem. That we could have some situations where the consumer would have been willing to pay for the product, but they can still enjoy the benefits without paying for the product. So let me give you an example here. I have a cell phone, but my cell phone is not on a contract. So it turns out that the consequence of that is that I am not paying a special tax that does exist when I have a contracted phone, like, you know, a 2-year contracted phone with Verizon or AT&T. That if in the case of my prepaid phone, there's no deduction or payment made for 911 service. Now, despite that, I can still have access to call 911 with my phone. So herein exists the problem. I have access to all the benefits of being able to call 911 without paying for it if I'm on a prepaid phone. Well, now we've got a problem. Because I, as an individual, am enjoying the benefits, yet I am not paying for it. There we go. Right? Now we've got a situation where I'm essentially freeloading. Not freeloading by choice. I'm not trying to dodge any payments or anything like that. It just so happens that for whatever reason, the way the laws are written, my prepaid phone does not have any deductions made for 911, unlike a regular phone does. So we've got a problem. The problem would be is that then if the 911 service were only paid for out of the money that they got from everyone on a contract phone, they wouldn't have enough money. And as a result, maybe 911 would be only open 20 hours of the day rather than 24 hours a day because they're not getting enough money. So herein lies part of the failure. What we're going to call this is a product then that's imposing a positive externality, meaning that there's some benefit created for others. And as a result, maybe it should be subsidized. Here's another side of this, right? The other side of this could be something along the lines of a supply side failure. And in a supply side failure, the issue that we have going on here is that the firm is doing something, or an individual is doing something, and it imposes a cost on others, but they do not have to pay those costs. And the consequence then is I do too much of something. So again, the example I used here was, well, for instance, I don't pay when I drive. I don't pay a toll when I use the road, and I don't pay even if I did pay a toll. I might not be charged for using it at different times. The road at different times. So consider the following: if I lived on the west side of the island and I was driving into town every day to go to work, just like a lot of Hawaiians do, shouldn't I pay almost more to drive during that peak time? Because I am imposing a cost on others. By my car being on the road, I am contributing to pollution, but I'm also, more importantly, contributing to, in this time of day, I'm contributing to a traffic jam, right? Slower traffic. But what if I got to pay different prices based on the time of day I drove? Right, so that I would pay less at 2 a.m. when no one else is on the road. But maybe I should pay more if I want to drive on that road at 8 a.m. What this is called is a negative externality. So if we just go back to the previous slide here, the problem is that without a government subsidy, meaning without the government providing some money, this thing, whatever it is not going to be done enough. And the alternative would be is that in the case of this product, where there's a negative externality. In some sense, it's done too much. Done too much. So you almost want to tax this thing that generates a negative externality, and you almost want to subsidize this thing that generates a positive externality. This thing is not done enough. This one's done too much. So the tax then stops me from doing something more than I should. The subsidy, on the other hand, encourages me to do it more. And so therein lies the problem, right? The problem would be is that when there are externalities, either positive or negative, the problem is that the demand curve is not truly reflecting all of our willingness to pay, and the supply curve is no longer reflecting all the cost of production. When a positive externality exists, what we're saying here is that some benefit was not captured. And when we're talking about the supply curve here as reflecting all the cost of production, here what we're saying is that for a negative externality, that not all the costs were reflected. So there we go, right? The whole idea of externalities is that they're not violating, there's no violation here of supply and demand. Rather, we're just saying supply and demand are not appropriate when an externality exists, because when there's a positive externality, that demand curve does not reflect everyone's willingness to pay. And when there's a negative externality, the supply curve does not reflect all the costs that are imposed. So then building on this, there's another kind of issue we need to make, and that would be the difference between private goods and public goods. Not that anyone should really care too much about this, but this was a bit about what my doctoral dissertation was about. So if I talk a little bit longer about this than usual, it's only because this is my favorite thing in economics. Most goods, almost all goods, I should say, most goods are both rival and excludable. These are goods that are then best delivered by the marketplace by individual firms. For goods to be rival, that means that my use reduces or prevents your use. And that what we're saying that for excludability is that I can stop use if you're not paying for it. So, for instance, I just went and got a hot dog at Costco. $1.50 for a hot dog and a soda. Pretty darn cheap. That's a private good. Costco sold it to me. And if I eat the hot dog, it certainly fulfills the conditions of rivalry, because every bite I take of the hot dog, that's one less bite I can give to someone else, right? Or if I buy a hot dog, you can't buy the same hot dog. It's also excludable. If I had not paid for that hot dog, I would not have gotten it. So almost everything we buy fulfills these two conditions: rivalry and excludability. But now let's think of things that could be non-rival but excludable, right? Just so you have an idea of that, because you might be tempted to say, well, all goods that we know of fulfill these two conditions. Well, what about, for instance, I really like to read, one of my favorite websites is news.google.com. I like that website because it basically represents, it's not like any newspaper specifically determining what my news is going to be. Rather, it's just a computer algorithm that just looks at all the websites and kind of combines and brings together all the news. So there's no human intervention there. And I can click on links and I can read the information. Now the thing about online newspapers and whatnot is that they are not rival. Every time I read some news, it's not preventing someone else from getting that same news, right? Two people can click on the website simultaneously and we'll both get the news at the same time. But even if we wanted to go non-electronic, if we wanted to go old school, right? If I wanted to go non-electronic, I could buy a newspaper. And in that newspaper, I could read it and then give it to my wife to read. And me having read that newspaper doesn't reduce the information that's contained in the newspaper for you to consume. But it can be excludable, right? I could say, for instance, for the newspaper, right, I have to pay for it for the first time. And then I could even charge my wife. Well, that would be pretty bad. But I could charge my wife to use the newspaper after me. Or if I'm looking at online news, right, a number of websites don't let you just look at the news on their sites for free. You have to sign up for an email subscription or a digital subscription or whatever. But now here's the question. How do you pay for that kind of good that is non-rival but potentially excludable? Right? That's why newspapers are a dying business. That's why online news is so competitive, because it's non-rival, but it is excludable, and potentially it's also non-excludable. So, what about a good, though, that is neither rival nor excludable? So I just explained information goods as non-rival but excludable. What about a good that is both non-rival and non-excludable? That would be something like the fire department. In the case of the fire department, me enjoying protection from the fire department doesn't reduce someone else enjoying that same protection, right? My neighbor and I can enjoy the protection, right, without that use reducing it for others. Alternatively, we can think of these kinds of goods as not being excludable, meaning that if I don't pay for the fire protection, I might still get to enjoy it, because in this case, if my house burns down, that fire could spread to other people's houses, and so I might get to enjoy protection without them paying for it. Well, when goods are both non-rival and non-excludable, this is what leads to the public good. So public goods are both non-rival and non-excludable. Now, when you see this, I don't want you to think that it has to be provided by the government. I'm just going to write here that it's typically provided by the government. And what I mean by that is that it's typically provided by the government because it's also then typically financed out of taxes. So, if that's the case, right, then we think of it as being offered for free, yet what you're really doing is paying for it out of taxes. And what we do by having it paid out of taxes is we avoid the free rider problem. The free rider problem is when individuals enjoy the benefits but don't pay the costs. Because if it's imposed on taxes, I don't really face a choice of not paying the costs, because if I don't pay my taxes, I can go to jail, right, and have to pay a huge fine. Right? We don't have debtors' prisons, so I can't go to jail for any debts, but I can go to jail if I don't pay my taxes. So public goods that are both non-rival and non-excludable are not going to be delivered by the market. Typically, they're going to be provided by the government, and we're going to all get to enjoy the benefits of that product, and the fact that it's paid for out of taxes eliminates this problem. So what do we have here? Just, kind of what do we have going on here? At this point, then, what we say is that markets work well for private goods. These would be goods that are both rival and excludable. And that markets also deal well with markets where there are no externalities. No positive externalities and no negative externalities. To the extent that the thing is not a private good, and to the extent that there is an externality, then you would almost need the government to get involved. Or you at least would have to admit that the market should not be delivering the product. Not for nothing, but that in some sense represents our healthcare debate, right, in terms of delivery. Right now, the federal government does actually provide health care if you're in the VA, right, or you have primarily through the VA. But the government doesn't deliver health care otherwise. The federal government doesn't deliver health care otherwise. And in terms of insurance, yes, we have Medicare and Medicaid and veterans insurance, for the Veterans Administration. But other than that, we basically allow on private insurance companies to deal with privately created hospitals and privately created doctors' offices. In other countries, right, like Britain, what was it? So my wife and son and I went to England, and in England, it's all government paid for healthcare and government delivered healthcare. Well, my son got pink eye, and it's a pretty bad thing to have, especially. But if you're a parent, you probably overreact because your kid looks really sick, and you're just like, okay, I need to take this kid to the doctor. Well, it turned out that, right, the thing about that kind of delivery of healthcare is that if you're willing to pay money, right, essentially pay a bribe to get to the head of the line, the doctors are all too willing to allow you to do that because, in this case, you're trying to impose market forces on a system that's already designed around everything being for free and paid for out of taxes. Just like the equivalent of me saying, right, I want extra protection from the police, so I'm willing to directly pay for some cops to just guard my house. I'm sure if you know the right people, and not too many people, taxpayers would get upset that you're reducing their care. They might not get too upset by that. But here's our tension then, right, is it looks bad. It looks bad because what I'm then doing when I paid to get my son to the head of the line is that I turned what was everyone else considered a public good into a private good. And that's socially offensible, right? That it doesn't look good. Just like if I got special police protection of just my house, it doesn't look good because we're all supposed to get police protection, and here I am, big money bag Scheiding, just paying his money to get something better, right? What I'm trying to say is that there's some politics involved in this notion of whether something is a private good or a public good. So how could we understand that? We can understand this on some level by this idea that for the demand curve, then I can look at what would it be optimal. What would it optimally be if we're talking about public goods? And in this case of public goods, what we're saying here is that if this is the optimal quantity, this is their optimal willingness to pay for those quantities of the good, right? And that as the goods become higher and higher and higher in value, or higher in quantity, then I'm less and less willing to pay for it. What that means for us here is that I then need to conduct this cost-benefit analysis, and I need to think about, if I decide to have something publicly provided versus privately financed, what's going to happen. Every time I decide to do something as a public good, it means that I'm taking something away from private production and people making private decisions to produce something. Right? If I want to keep the world safe from terrorism and I want to fight terrorists abroad, that's going to mean less stuff domestically that I'm going to produce, because I'm going to have to pay for it out of tax dollars, I'm going to need more troops, etc., etc., etc. And what you're hoping is that you're going to get more satisfaction or safety or security feelings by having that greater investment in the military that's going to offset the reduced production I'm going to have of the private goods. We need to do that for every public good. This is the debate that we are having right now. What is it, May? In this case, it's May 23rd. It's a debate we're having right now about rail in Hawaii. Right? The debate about rail in Hawaii is a debate on some level about whether that cost is far exceeding the benefit. I have no opinion. Look at this here, right? The other side of this then is, what do we do, right? This goes not only for rail, but what if we did something else, right? Like build a 2-lane, a 4-lane, 6-lane highway. We have to compare that benefit, or I'm sorry, the benefit to the cost. We should not build a 6-lane highway in this scenario here, because the net benefit is negative. We should be strongly designed or engaged in perhaps building a 4-lane highway, because then the net benefit at least then is 4. And that's how we should do these things, right? Let's get out of the, on some level, let's get out of the politics of whether we're going to do rail, or even like things like legalizing marijuana, or 21 is the age that you can buy cigarettes. Pick your public policy, and we can engage in the same kind of analysis here. So I've already kind of given you the, I've already kind of discussed this a bit here already here, but our positive externality, again, if you just refer back to the previous slides, positive externalities are my demand side failure, negative externalities are my supply side failure. How do you know that you've got these situations happening? Is that in positive externalities, too often too little is produced, and in negative externalities, too much is produced. Positive externalities. A library is a perfect example of a thing that delivers a positive externality, right? That studies repeatedly show that children learn more the earlier they read, the more they read, and certainly libraries would be a perfect place where they can do just such a thing. Yeah. They don't get a lot of public funding, right? And they get very few, little bit in donations. The result is that the library is open, it's like open like, 9 to 5, and open a few hours on a Saturday, which might not be enough, right? Especially if you have kids that want to go to the library every day, or if you want to have parents that want to take them and those parents are working. There's too few libraries and not enough hours at the existing libraries. We should be financing it more, perhaps, if we're looking at it from that side. Or on the other side, it's that the negative externality would be, because the H1 is not a toll road, I drive on that road too much. And that means, right, is that I'm causing congestion. I'm causing all these bad things by driving my car. Pollution, etc. Again, our solution would be that for the positive externality, there should be a government subsidy most of the time. The government should be paying money to have the library open more, or pay to have more libraries opened. And that for negative externalities, there should be some sort of government tax. Okay. I'm going to pause it right here for a second. So with that said then, how does that look? The way that negative externalities then tend to look is that basically what we're saying here is that the cost otherwise, because there is a negative externality, what that means is happening for a negative externality is that there are higher costs. That the market accounts for. I certainly pay for gasoline, right? I certainly pay for the use of the roads with my taxes. But the problem that we're saying here is that me using the road at particular times is imposing a greater cost than what I'm actually paying for. What that means is that my supply curve for myself is right there. But that the supply curve, let's say, for society is right there, that it's greater cost for society. That difference, this vertical distance between the two curves, that's the cost that I impose on society. So, what we should do, right, is that here I am, me, myself, making a decision based on what I pay for gasoline, and I am choosing point C as my optimal point, right? The intersection of my own supply curve and my demand curve. But the problem is that I'm doing that thing too much, because if I actually had to pay for those extra costs that I'm imposing on society, I would instead then have this supply curve be my relevant supply curve, and I would instead be here. And you can see that because I'm not charged that extra amount, I then over-consume that product by this amount. For the positive externalities, there's my private benefit, but here's the social benefit. The vertical distance between the two is the it's the benefit that I generate on some level for society, right? Society benefits if my kid doesn't become a criminal, right? And certainly my own child benefits from that. But I figured out the way to get rid of that problem. There's certainly a benefit to my child not becoming a criminal by learning how to read and do those kinds of things. But I don't capture that social benefit in any way unless there's a subsidy, right? Unless there's a subsidy that allows me then to not consume right here, which is my private benefit and my supply curve, but rather find a way to get that extra benefit that I generate for society by raising a child that does not become a criminal, making my new relevant point of equilibrium at point Z. Meaning that if there is no subsidy for this product, I will under-consume this product of going to the library. Right? Here we've got higher benefits than the market accounts for. And that's what the subsidy does here. A subsidy allows me to capture those higher benefits, just like a tax imposes on me those higher costs. And by the government getting involved in this, if we didn't have the government at all, the problem would be that I would be stuck here, which means I'm doing that thing too much. And if the government didn't get involved, I'd be stuck here with not enough of it being done. But if the government all of a sudden gets involved and says you pay a higher tax for using the H1 between 8 and 10 a.m., now my costs go up and I now start driving that route less. And on this side here, if we then start to say, hey, we don't want kids to become drug addicts and criminals, we're going to start paying for preschool for kids, right? Or we'll give you a subsidy or a stipend to help you pay for your costs of sending your kid to preschool. Well, now all of a sudden I'm here rather than here. And that's exactly what we see here, right? Is that in this case of government intervention, it either can tax a negative externality, it can subsidize a positive externality, or the alternative can be, it can just directly say, you can't drive, only cars that have a license plate that end in an even number can't drive on these days, right? They can either directly control the amount, or they can just say you have to impose those higher costs or get to capture some of those extra benefits. But most of the time they use taxes and subsidies. And that's exactly what we see here, right? That whereas a negative externality existed here, what the tax does in the case of a negative externality, where the tax is the amount of the additional costs, then it directly replaces it and they end up at an optimal point. Or in the case of the positive externality, same thing. And in the case of the positive externality, what I see here is that right, the amount of the subsidy replaces the benefit that I don't capture. And the result is that by having a subsidy that's exactly that same amount of the benefit, I also get the same thing, the same benefit, where I get some idea of the product being produced, right? This is the subsidy to consumers. It doesn't make any difference whether I give the subsidy to the consumers or the producers. Either way, I'm getting my optimal quantity. It just depends on how you want to deliver it. Now, it doesn't have to always be, I don't want you to think that it always has to be that the government has to get involved, though, either. I mean, we can certainly talk about how the government can intervene by imposing by options 3 and 4, and by options 2, 3, and 4. Right? The government can say, we want veterans to get health care, so we're going to directly provide it. Or we can talk about or in the case of like the military or clean water or the fire department, where the government directly provides those things, or it encourages people to do things, right? Like solar panels, right? Solar panels, I certainly get a private benefit if I install a solar panel, in the sense that I have a cheaper electric bill. But it's also the case that I'm reducing the entire society's dependence on fossil fuels for the creation of electricity, which means that, right, I'm generating a benefit for the whole. There should be a subsidy for me to encourage me to install solar panels. Or again, negative externalities, I should either impose a tax or directly stop people from doing things too much. But there are options, namely 1, 2, and 5 here for the negative externalities and 1 for the positive externality, where instead I could say, you know what, I don't politically, philosophically, from a political standpoint, I don't want the government to get too involved. I'm kind of telling you here a little bit of a line of, like, if you're a very strong, conservative, leaning individual and you don't like big government, I'm not trying to push big government on anyone here, because this is only one solution. There's this economic principle known as the Coase Theorem, which then basically says, you know what, a different way of doing it would just be give people clear property rights and let them privately bargain with each other. So for instance, if houses along the H1 could all say, you know what, like, you're really contributing to our asthma problem by all driving on this road. So we have a right to, let's say that the government gives them a right to clean air. Well, then they can say, anyone that uses the H1, you have to pay us some money to accept this problem, or you don't get to use the road. I'd go a different way. What if the government gave the right to people to drive on whatever roads they wanted at whatever time? Well, then all the asthma sufferers that live along the H1 could pay people to use the bus or not go to work at all, right? We could do something other than get the government involved through private bargaining and clear legal rights being given. The only thing I care about as an economist is that we get an optimal amount and that the market then accurately reflects the costs and the benefits to all of society so that I reach that equilibrium. As long as you're reaching an equilibrium, as an economist, I don't care what society decides. You want to know my opinion about the train, the rail? I don't have one. I don't have one because I just think we need to compare the benefits to the cost. Now, what does this then mean about the tax burden as a whole? Now, no one likes paying taxes, myself included. Well, what we have to think about in terms of taxes are two principles. One, this whole idea of the benefits received, and two, the ability to pay. For the benefits received, there's one sense in which I should pay taxes to the extent that I receive a benefit for it. So for instance, for property taxes, there's a portion on it that goes to the school system, there's a portion on it that goes to the fire department, to the police department, etc., etc. Well, I should, if I'm receiving those kinds of benefits for those kinds of things, I should pay for it. Then there's this whole other idea that if I'm able to pay these kinds of taxes and help all society, I should, because I'm a member of that society. So let's say that I had no kids, I was a bachelor who lived in a concrete house and had concrete furniture, nothing that could burn, right? I should still pay taxes because let's say I have a really high paying job and I should just pay my fair weight, right? How that tax exists, well, that's part of the thing that society can then talk about. Should the taxes be progressive, regressive, or proportional? In the case of progressive, those who earn more pay more. And this is the kind of tax system we have here in the U.S. If you look at the tax brackets, right, those who earn the most pay the highest percentage of their money in taxes. A regressive tax is that as my income increases, I pay less in taxes as a percent. The reason why that occurs is because maybe we say, you know what, people who earn more, they should spend more money like investing in their own business and giving people jobs. They shouldn't be paying more in taxes. Or you could just say everyone pays the same. I used to live in the state of Indiana. I went to Notre Dame. In Indiana, everyone paid a flat 5% income tax in Indiana. So the tax form was incredibly simple. It was just, what is your income? Multiply by 0.05. This is how much tax you owe. Me, as a poor student, paid the same percentage. And I didn't pay the same amount, but I paid the same percentage as an incredibly rich person in Indiana. I don't know who the richest person in Indiana was. Farmer? I don't know. There's arguments to be made for the value, which one's better or which one's not. The way that this again exists in general here is that, for instance, our personal income tax, at least in the state of Hawaii as well as on the federal level, is progressive. The more we earn, the more we pay. The sales tax is generally regressive, meaning that the more you pay, the less the burden is, because all of us who are buying products, we only buy so much, right? I eat the same amount of food, at least on a calorie basis, as a poor person does, perhaps. but the sales tax is less of a burden for me because I'm so rich compared to the poor person. That's what makes it a regressive tax. As a corporate tax, what we could instead say for a corporate tax would be that these would be it's proportional to the extent that all firms in general pay the same proportion of their earnings as a corporate tax. And then finally, for the payroll tax, it's regressive because after, what is it, Social Security, you only pay taxes up to, I think it's 110,000. So the very rich only pay this pretty significant tax of almost 8%, only up to their first 100,000. After that, they're not paying that tax anymore, which means that their overall tax burden is going down. What this means here for taxes in general, for the personal income tax, is that it is a progressive tax based on the marginal tax rate. And you could do a Google search if you're just curious about this topic of the marginal tax rates in the U.S. I think the lowest bracket is 10%, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, it goes up to 35%. Meaning that the highest income earners are paying 35%, the poorest individuals are paying 10%. Everyone on some level does pay taxes, just that they're paying a lesser portion of it. Payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and then the rest of the tax bill is paid for with excise taxes. That means special taxes they pay on, like gasoline, on liquor, for cigarettes. Certain products have a special tax applied to them. And that's what you just see here. I'm not sure how much I really want to go much more into taxes here. But the reason why I'm talking about so much about taxes is because this is what pays for the public goods, and this is what pays for the externalities. And there's, this is from 2011. It hasn't changed too much from there. But if I earned anywhere between $1 and $17,000, I'm only paying 10%. Whereas if I'm earning $212,000 to $379,000, I'm paying 33% of my taxes. The consequence of being more successful is that for each dollar earned, so for each dollar earned in this bracket, I'm paying 10%. But now for each dollar earned in this bracket, I'm paying 15%. So if I had a income of, let's say, $18,000, that would mean that there are $17,000 that I'm paying 10%. And then there are, let's say, then in this case, there are going to be $999 that I'm going to pay 15% because there's $999 between $17,001 and $18,000. Right, and I could then determine, right, by adding the two up, sorry, I'm just doing it right here. There's my total tax bill. The general result of all of this is that our overall tax system is progressive as a whole. The federal tax system is progressive. State and local tax structures are largely regressive, meaning they hurt the poor in general. And again, that's a little bit tinged with personal belief there, so don't take that as a gospel here or anything like that. By that I mean that when I say it hurts the poor, I basically am saying here is that state and local governments care a great deal about local economic development, and the way they get that local economic development is by having rich people treated better than others. And by treated better, I mean paying lower taxes so that they're investing back into their community. So where I grew up, they just got an IKEA. They're building a big IKEA store. and they get this huge break on their property taxes. So here we have a very successful business, big, huge company, IKEA, paying less in taxes because they are so big. Whereas if I wanted to open up my own store, Tom's Furniture Store, right, which is going to compete against IKEA, I'm going to have to probably pay property taxes. Well, that's just the way the state and local government system is constructed. And the way that this then exists is that, yes, the government can have a role, doesn't have to, but it can have a role in correcting for externalities. If you don't want the government to get involved, then you have to use that Coase Theorem, where you have private bargaining for things. But the only way you can do any of this is if you correctly identify the cause, and you find some way around it. And you have to do this all in the context of the political situation. The rail is a perfect example of all this messiness that exists here. We know that there's an externality if we drive on the H1, yet how we actually fix that and control for that, well, that's a pretty messy kind of thing. And I'm not entirely certain how we would control for that kind of thing. Okay. That concludes chapter 5.